Welcome to The Game. This is the show where we go play by play analyzing the game of politics. First, we break down what the GOP needs to hold control in 2026. Then we zoom into Pennsylvania, the battleground inside the battleground state, the House races that could define the majority in Congress. And finally, we look at the latest moves by President Donald Trump on tariffs and how it's testing the patience of many of his allies in Congress. And here with me today to analyze these topics is former Congressman Charlie Dent, who served as chairman of the House Committee, and he was also a senior member of the Appropriations Committee. He now serves as the national co-chair of Our Republican Legacy. Congressman, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing fantastic. Great to have you on the show. Very exciting topics. I mean, we're going to kick it off with a topic that many folks are thinking here in the last month before 2026, and I think are going to be driving the headlines in January. And can the GOP retain control? Many of us have looked at the November elections. We saw what Democrats did in New York, Virginia, and in New Jersey. New Jersey and Virginia are two states where it's no surprise that Democrats won, but many folks were looking at the margins of their wins, and they're looking at that election and saying, is there something similar that Democrats might try to do in 2026? So I do want to start with you, Congressman. Historically, the president's party does lose several seats after their presidential election, but there are some exceptions. Bill Clinton in 1998 was able to add a few seats to the majority that Democrats already had. President George Bush in his first term, right in 2002, I was going to say 2022, but no, in 2002, he was able to gain several seats. Again, that was coming off of 9/11, which was a horrific event that impacted those elections. But when you look at the landscape for next year, what is your analysis? What are the hardships and the barriers that Republicans might be facing? How do you think they're going to deal with them, and what do you see the outcome for next year?
Well, you're absolutely right that the midterm election is always difficult for the president's party. And I expect this midterm to be fairly typical in that regard. But we should also look at what's just happened in 2025. Here we are facing a special election today in Tennessee, where the Republican candidate is, leading in the polls by the thinnest of margins, within the margin of error, and a seat that Donald Trump won by 22 points. But if you look at the special elections that occurred this year in 2025, in addition to the off-year election a few weeks ago, where Democrats did exceedingly well, this does not bode well for Republicans going into the midterm. And by the way, in all these special elections that we saw, there were two special elections for Florida congressional seats, the Matt Gaetz seat and the Mike Waltz seat. These are seats that I think the incumbents won by over 30 points, when they were in office. And the special elections, the Republican candidates, I think, won by 12 and 15 points. And so you can see a significant Republican underperformance or a Democratic overperformance in those districts. In Pennsylvania, we saw a state Senate election in Lancaster County. This is a state Senate seat, by the way, that has never elected a Democrat. It's always, since Abraham Lincoln, they've only ever elected Republicans. I know the area. And we saw a Democrat state senator prevail there. We also seen other special elections around the country where Democrats have, again, performed exceedingly well. So I'm not just looking at one race or one poll. I'm looking at a series of events. So now we go into the midterm, and for the Republicans, the atmospherics here, the political environment is going to need to change significantly for Republicans to be able to hold the House. Right now, it does not look promising. Hell, they might even lose the majority before the election if there are further resignations, in addition to the one by Marjorie Taylor Greene, which was announced about a week ago. So there you have it. It's just going to be a tough headwind, no matter how you slice this thing. And a lot of people are going to look at the special election results tonight in Tennessee. I don't know how that election is going to come out. The Republican will probably win, but it'll be by a diminished margin. He's not going to win by 22 points. And the Republican candidate has a pretty good bio. He's a West Point guy. But this whole election cycle, it seems, is a referendum on the President of the United States, his stewardship of the economy, and his conduct in office.
You brought up a very interesting dynamic is that there are members who have already signaled that they will resign next year. And I think there is a chance we'll probably see several other members who are going to be looking at the landscape. And they're, I think some of them just tired and looking at other opportunities outside of serving in Congress. It's a dynamic that is going to impact the shaping of these maps next year. But speaking of maps, I did want to ask you, there is, a good part of this year, there was a focus in Texas on how the state legislature redrew their maps. Again, a historic move in the sense that this typically doesn't happen at the midpoint of a decade. And we do know that this happens essentially every decade after the census. But then this has created a ripple effect where California just passed in November, they passed a referendum allowing them to look at their maps and redrawing. There are other states who have talked about also Florida, Illinois, about possibly redrawing their states. How do you think this plays out? Does it all just cancel each other out? What Texas did is canceled out by what California did, and then what Illinois does maybe cancels out what Florida does? Or is there an advantage? Will you think one group, one party over the other might see an advantage with the changes of these maps?
Repeat after me. The juice is not worth the squeeze. And what I mean by that is that, okay, Texas did what it did, canceling out 5 Democratic seats, hoping to make them Republican. California retaliated and now has approved a map that is, the voters have approved a map that will eliminate 5 Republican seats. And of course, the Texas map is in court, and it's uncertain how the Supreme Court will rule on that map. You've got Indiana, Missouri, North Carolina, and others. Indiana's debating whether or not to redraw their maps. Maryland is looking at it, Illinois, New York, potentially Virginia, New Jersey. These are all states that could enter into this fray, Florida. But at the end of the day, I think Republicans could end up netting out a few additional seats. And again, the big wild card here is Texas. This could be a major disaster if the Supreme Court rules against the new Texas map. So, like I said, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Given all this effort, time, money, lawyers, to net out a couple seats, is it really worth it? I would argue that it is not. I do think that Congress should pass a law banning mid-decade redistricting. Once every 10 years is enough. Having been a state legislator for 14 years and in Congress for nearly 14 years, I have been through 3 redistrictings, and my hands are not clean when it comes to this issue. So I'm very familiar with this process and how difficult it is. People don't really like doing this. We do it after the census for a reason, but having to do it more than once a decade to me is just it really is I think it's unnecessary, and it sets really bad precedents going forward. And that's where I think Congress could intervene to limit this redistricting process to every 10 years, unless the courts demand a redraw for some reason.
I do think that idea will surface a bit more as folks start seeing, like you said, that the juice is not worth the squeeze, and they'll start seeing how some of these states will either cancel each other out, or where there might be that moment of backfire where, again, if Texas's map, if they're not able to fully move forward with it, that really takes things out of the hands of the GOP, where almost you might see a Democrat advantage, and you might see a movement within Congress on folks taking up the idea that you just proposed here of having legislation that doesn't allow that. Congressman, I do want to see if you could take us behind the scenes. You've been in Congress. It's a December, before a midterm election. Typically, what are members, what are majorities thinking through? And if you look at this year specifically, I would think one of the bigger wins that this Congress would point at is that they would say that they extended the 2017 Trump's tax cuts. I think many folks maybe don't feel that as a win. I'm referring to voters, specifically because what that legislation did is what it stopped taxes from going up. If it would have been another decrease, maybe folks would have seen the difference. And although I believe it's important that taxes did not go up, but again, the fact that this was just a stopping of increase, it's not that it's necessarily felt. So the point I'm trying to make is I think next year there will be a need for Republicans to show a win coming out of Congress. So again, take us behind the scenes. What do you think members are thinking of when it comes to next year in reference to a win?
Well, you're right. The Republicans were successful with their reconciliation bill, the one big beautiful bill. They were able to enact it with the slimmest of majorities on a partisan vote. But you just pointed out, but the tax provisions in that law essentially extend the 2017 tax law. And I voted for the 2017 tax law. Republicans got walloped in the 2018 midterm election, largely over health care, but it was also a midterm, and all those dynamics we just discussed. So I can make a case that the tax law really did nothing to help Republicans in the 2018 midterm. So what they did is they essentially extended current law, and they added some provisions too that dealt with no taxes on tips and also on overtime. But I don't really think that that's going to help them in the midterm. In fact, there are other provisions of that bill or that law that are going to prove problematic, particularly as it relates to Medicaid and healthcare, where there will be people losing coverage as a result of the changes made there. Also, there will be changes to the SNAP program, food assistance program, that many will find as quite negative. So I think on balance, the bill is not very popular. So I'm not sure people are going to say, boy, here's our big victory, let's run on it. It's not doing well in terms of polling. So if you're a Republican congressman after this, you just had a nice Thanksgiving with your family, hopefully, and you're having conversations about what you should do. But if you're a Republican in a district that Donald Trump won by 10 points or less, you have to think really hard about whether or not you want to run again. Because you're going to be running into a buzzsaw. Now, you can win. Don't get me wrong. You can win. It's going to be the fight of your life. And they know that. And some are going to say, is it the fight worth it to come back and probably be in the minority party? Likely Republicans will lose the majority. Not saying they will, but it's likely they will. And you really want to come back into the minority in a diminished position, given that Congress, frankly, has ceded a lot of authorities over to the executive branch on tariffs and taxes and spending. The president is rescinding monies that Congress has appropriated into law. And so you really want to come back under those circumstances and then spend the next 2 years, feeling compelled to defend the Trump administration. We got Secretary Hegseth out there now being accused of war crimes and other issues. RFK and his anti-vax proposals. I mean, you've got all sorts of things. You're going to have to defend, or you'll have to defend. You really want to do that?
Yeah, it's a lot of dynamics that are going to be going through the minds of these members as they're thinking through what to do next, which I think is a good segue into the next topic that we wanted to look at, is specifically Pennsylvania. I'm in Florida, Miami, Florida, and I remember how we were once one of those key swing states. When you looked at, we used to say that the road to the White House goes through Florida. The truth is that's not as true anymore. Florida has become a little bit more of a solid red state, but Pennsylvania, I would say in the last 3 to 4 or 3 to 2 elections has really been center stage for a lot of the conversation for the presidential race, but also because it has key House and I would say last year key Senate races. Pennsylvania has really become one of those true swing states, taking the place maybe of an Ohio or even of a Florida. It's your home state. Talk to us a little bit of the dynamics of Pennsylvania. How is it that it has become this immense swing state? What are the demographic changes, or what are the components that make Pennsylvania center stage now in politics?
Well, I think you're right that Pennsylvania is the new Ohio or the new Florida. I remember when I was years ago when President George W. Bush was in Florida and Ohio were probably the two key battleground states. Pennsylvania was among the battleground states, but we were not seen as evenly divided as maybe if we had a slight lean Democrat, very slight, and Florida and Ohio were seen as true toss-ups. Well, it's now Pennsylvania that's the true toss-up, and Florida and Ohio are now seen as fairly deep red states now. Not the deepest of red, but red enough, and not always seen as very competitive. So Pennsylvania has an interesting mix of urban, suburban, and rural voters. Most of the vote in Pennsylvania, I think about 40% of the voters are in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia media market, which would include the city of Philadelphia, the 4 collar counties, and you could extend that out a little further, like where I live in the Lehigh Valley, just to the north, and out into, say, Lancaster County, just out, and Berks County, just out to the west of north and west of the Philadelphia region, and that's where most of the vote is. And I always say that vote east of the Susquehanna River is Pennsylvania is kind of more like a northeastern state in many ways. You get west of the Susquehanna River, and it looks more like a Midwestern state. And that's just a simple fact. Also, when I was growing up in politics, we had in the northeastern part of the state, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, in the southwestern part of the state, the Pittsburgh region, the Allegheny County region. Those were very reliably Democratic areas. But we had what we used to call the Catholic Democrat, or some would call the Casey Democrat, for the former governor, not the senator, his son, but the father, who was a very well-known pro-life advocate. And we used to call them the Casey Catholic Democrats, pro-labor, pro-life, pro-gun. That was a common characteristic of many Democratic voters in Pennsylvania. That is not the case anymore. Many of those folks have migrated to the Republican Party, and you've seen that nationally, and certainly you've seen it in Pennsylvania. By the flip side of that is those collar counties of Philadelphia, these suburban communities of Philadelphia, the Lehigh Valley, the suburban communities of Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. These were very reliably Republican areas, have now become very Democratic areas, largely. I mean, some are still a little competitive, but most are very Democratic. And so we have seen this massive shift, a complete flip. In fact, back in the day, again, back when Rick Santorum and I both ran for office in 1990, he out in the West for Congress, me in the State House. And we both surprised the world, and a couple others did too that year, where we beat incumbent Democrats. And we could see things starting to change. We didn't. I didn't know Rick Santorum. He didn't know me. We're different ends of the state, but we met after the election. But the point I guess I'm making is we could see things starting to change, to move, to shift. And I would say that change accelerated dramatically under Donald Trump, where the suburban Republican vote has just collapsed. But the flip side of that is the non-college educated working class voter. That voter has been drawn to the GOP in huge numbers, and so the maps have just changed in terms of where Republicans are getting their votes from. And I used to say that in southwestern Pennsylvania, I used to say these people who were registered Democrats but often voted Republican. So they were what I would call functional Republicans, even though they were registered Democrats. The flip of that is in suburban Philadelphia, even over the years, we had a lot of registered Republicans who were functional Democrats, particularly in presidential years. But now I think many people have aligned their voter registration with their voting patterns. And so that is people are much more sorted. Republican voters, of course, in Pennsylvania are better distributed than Democratic voters, who tend to be much more concentrated in major urban metropolitan areas.
And you mentioned places like Lee Valley. Lancaster and Allentown come to mind, and those I think cities became front and center in many of the elections also because of Hispanic voters, and many of them registered as independent. Many of them leaving places like New York or moving from different states, but looking for that new opportunity, looking for economic progress and mobility. And many of them registered independents did vote in key election races. If I'm not mistaken, I'm forgetting his first name, but Congressman McKenzie in a very key race in Pennsylvania saw some gains and margins with the Hispanic vote. Donald Trump also saw shifts in that area. What's your analysis there? What role do Hispanic voters, minority voters across the board play in the GOP's formula to trying to stay in power when it comes to Pennsylvania, maybe in state races, but also in those House races that are going to impact Congress? No
question the Hispanic vote is becoming increasingly critical for Republicans. And a major reason why Republicans performed well in 2024 was because many Hispanics, particularly Hispanic men, migrated to the Republican Party in that election. The question that we're all asking is, was this a one-off situation, or is this a more permanent realignment? Well, based on the results in the off-year election, it seems like it was a one-off, but we'll see. We don't know. I think it's still too early to tell. And in fact, it used to shock people when I would tell some of my colleagues, my district was, I think, number 6 or 7 in terms of Puerto Ricans in my district. I had the largest Puerto Rican population. It was in the top 10. my district, and another one held by a Republican, Lloyd Smucker of Lancaster County, he was also in the top 10. And I used to shock people. I said, no, I have probably one of the largest Puerto Rican populations of any member of Congress in the country. And they're thinking, well, what about New York City and Florida and Chicago? I said, yeah, there's some districts there that are also heavily Hispanic, but with Puerto Rican population. But mine is in the top 10. In fact, we also have not just Puerto Ricans. We have a lot of Dominicans. We're seeing more and more people from the Central America, obviously Mexicans. And so we have a very large and diverse Latino population. And I've always liked to point out that the Latino population is not monolithic. You know, these people, you don't call a Cuban a Puerto Rican or a Puerto Rican a Mexican. I mean, you just wouldn't do such a thing. And they have their own particular views on issues. You know, we all know Cubans and many Venezuelans have been, closer to the Republican Party in South Florida because of their experience with socialist communist governments. You know, the Mexican Americans in Texas have, been embraced by many Republicans there and have performed pretty well. I think the Puerto Rican population, though, or the Hispanic population, I should say more generally, up in the Lehigh Valley still tends to be pretty Democratic. But we're seeing those margins shift. And you mentioned Ryan McKenzie, who just won my old House seat by 4,000 votes, defeating Susan Wild, who won it after I left. And she had always won the seat in very tight elections herself. And she served 3 terms as a Democrat, and then Ryan McKenzie has won as a Republican. And he's going to be one of those Republican races. His seat will be one of those Republican races to watch. He's running into a real headwind, as is Bresnahan up in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area. Oh, that area is a bit more, I'll say, a bit more MAGA, a bit more Trumpy than the Lehigh Valley-based district where I was. And, of course, Scott Perry in Pennsylvania, in the Harrisburg capital region, his seat is also going to be very competitive. So there are at least 3 very competitive races. Brian Fitzpatrick is in perhaps one of the ultimate swing counties, Bucks County. He's got a good brand, and he, of all of them, should be best able to withstand this type of a storm. But even he is going to see, a major challenge, I'm sure, just because of the type of year that we are in. And these seats are, like I said, all 4 of those seats I mentioned are competitive. And in the case of the Lehigh Valley, though, I do want to point out, it's not just an increase in Hispanic population that we've witnessed, but we also see a lot of more South Asians, particularly Indian Americans, who have grown at a pretty significant rate. And so Pennsylvania is a more diverse state than it was. I would still say it's probably more largely a whiter state than many states, but but our Hispanic population, South Asian population, of course, we've always had a strong African American community, particularly in the Philadelphia region. But we've so we are a diverse state, and in so many ways, demographically, I talk about the geography too. I always used to say too, if you look at the state, you look at the center of the state and across the northern tier, we would call that the T. You go up the middle and out the top. That was the Republican areas, and Republicans are always expected to do exceedingly well there, and they still typically do. But remember, much of the game is going to be won or lost in that Philadelphia media market. So keep your eyes on that.
Yeah, very much so. Something I think most folks are going to be looking at for next year. And I think a very valid point when it comes to the Hispanic community, and that many folks are asking, was this sort of a one-off, or is it baked in from one side or the other? And I think that's the key question, because I think the tendency we've seen with many Hispanic voters, while there have been on the margins a move to registration for Republican, the vast majority of Hispanics continue to either be registered independent or Democrat. There is a formula there, or there is a sense of that Hispanics are open to making that shift. They're open to being won over, but it's not something you can take as baked in for your party. So I think both Democrats and Republicans are really going to have to fight for Latinos if they want to make gains next year. But I do want to turn to the topic of trade, which has also been front and center this year, and is one that is not foreign at all for Pennsylvania, a state that understands very much the impacts of trade and tariffs when it comes to our nation. I did want to ask you on that topic. There are different, I would say, maybe sound bites that folks point to, or promises that folks point to when it comes to Donald Trump and his conversation on tariffs. At a certain point, it was really a focus on him saying, we're going to bring jobs back. There were other moments where he talked about the fairness component. There were other moments where he talks about the revenue coming in. And I think within the GOP, there's been maybe somewhat of a silent debate for some individuals on this approach. The GOP historically has been very focused on the free markets, on free trade. I wanted to get your take. It seems that this silent debate is now becoming a little bit more vocal. Politico just had an article that points to that the tariffs are testing the patience of GOP members who have to go back to their districts and talk about the impacts of it. Where do you see this conversation going? Do you think members are going to become a little bit more vocal on this topic, possibly a little bit less aligned with the president on the topic of tariffs?
Here's my quick take on this. I'm part, as you know, I'm part of an organization called Our Republican Legacy. I'm one of the national co-chairs, and we believe that the Republican Party needs to get back to some basic fundamental principles, like the rule of law, like the union and unity, like opening markets. We believe in opening markets for American producers and farmers and manufacturers. We believe in all those things, and we feel the party has drifted on some of these key issues. We believe in peace through strength, embracing allies, rejecting autocrats. We believe in free and fair elections, and that the outcomes should be respected and upheld. And we found January 6th to be an abomination. But on trade, we believe, and I certainly believe, that these tariffs are wrong-headed and potentially disastrous. The reason given for these tariffs is that we're somehow going to magically bring back manufacturing. And I can tell you, nearly every manufacturer with whom I have spoken is very upset about these tariffs because their input costs are going up. Much of what we make in this country, does have components or parts or ingredients that have to be imported, and those inputs then are used to make things in America that are sold in the United States and also exported. So we are raising their costs, and of course America's farmers are, as predicted, are experiencing retaliation and retribution from countries who have been tariffed by the United States. Actually, we pay the taxes, but those tariffs, say on China, ask American soybean farmers, how this trade war is going for them. It's not going very well. And as we all know, with these tariffs, which are taxes, that the privileged few are protected at the expense of the many. Now, very specifically, I'll give you two examples. I represented Hershey, Pennsylvania. Make a lot of chocolate there. At peak production, they produce 70 million chocolate kisses a day. Okay, that's a lot of loving. So
that's a lot of loving, yes.
Yeah, so that's a lot of loving. But they're all those kisses are wrapped in a very fine aluminum foil. Okay, so you raise tariffs. Tariffs are imposed on aluminum. Well, guess what? The price of packaging just went up. Okay, Trump's tariffs imposed under the IEEPA law, the International Economic Emergencies Power Act. He's put tariffs on cocoa. And last time I checked, we don't grow cocoa in the United States or North America. So we have to import it from places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. That's where it comes from. Well, guess what? The price of cocoa's gone up, and there's no substitute. So of course people are going to feel impacts. When they did the steel tariffs, when the Trump administration did the steel tariffs during Trump 1, in the name of national security, the last steel beer keg manufacturer in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, just outside of my district, they closed because steel prices went up. So, okay, congratulations. Just closed the last steel beer keg manufacturer because they raised steel prices. Again, there were more steel users who were negatively impacted than there were steel makers. And we always find that the case is that we will lose more jobs, more manufacturing jobs among those in the steel industry than will be protected in actual steel makers. So this is true across the board. There are more negative consequences, and we can get into agriculture as well, and even like things like Canada. I mean, look at this. The president seems to be obsessed with Canada, as a trade threat. And I keep pointing this out to folks. Okay, the Trumps, he seems to think that the Canadians are ripping us off. I said, okay, if you're a corn grower in Iowa or Nebraska, and you buy potash from the Canadians, to fertilize your fields, and you grow your corn, you sell a whole bunch of it in the U.S. and you export a whole bunch of it to Mexico. These are all voluntary transactions. Nobody's stealing from anybody here. This is just normal business. And I think that's where I'm kind of confused. And the president's obsessed with, the fact that we run a trade deficit with Canada. Well, that was by design. Because we import so much energy from Canada, particularly oil, and that's why we were trying to approve a Keystone pipeline that I supported. Your old boss, Catherine McMorris Rodgers, and others, we all supported this because we didn't mind becoming more dependent on Canada for oil because they're considered an ally, a reliable partner, a friendly, rather than having to buy that product from maybe more unstable parts or unfriendly parts of the world, like Venezuela. So this is what, and so okay, when you take oil out of the equation, we run a pretty big trade surplus with Canada, but it's okay that we're buying oil from Canada. We wanted to do that. We wanted to become North American energy self-sufficient, and we largely are. And so I don't understand any of this. Why declare a trade war on countries that share our interests and our values, whether they be in Canada or Mexico or in Europe or in South Korea or Japan or Australia and New Zealand? I don't understand the thinking here. And China is the problem on trade. Yes, there is unfair trade practice there with coercive technology transfers, with illegal dumping. We go down a long list of things that they do, theft of intellectual property. And we should be partnering with our friends and allies and finding ways to use perhaps tariffs or countervailing duties in a very targeted way to go after bad trade behavior. Trump is using trade. He's using tariffs as a weapon on things that are completely unrelated to trade. He's smacked massive tariffs on Brazil, a country with which we hold a trade surplus, because of the prosecution of Bolsonaro, the former president with whom Trump felt closely aligned. This has nothing to do with trade. He's mad at the current government, and he just slapped tariffs on them for that reason. It makes no sense. And again, I think this is doing a great deal to damage relations between the United States and many countries, which we will need for a variety of reasons internationally. And we're damaging relationships and partnerships that we never should. In fact, this is also going to affect investment decisions. I do think that a lot of people may be less inclined to invest in the U.S. if they think the political environment and the tariff environment in particular is so unsteady and uncertain. So these are all things that have to be discussed and considered as we go through this. But at the end of the day, Americans will pay more. Manufacturers are struggling with this. Farmers are paying an enormous price. And we need to get back to opening markets for American producers. I mean, these trade agreements, frankly, Congress has abdicated its role here. Congress should be voting on these tax increases. This is Article 1, power of the purse authority of Congress. They should take back this authority. And in fact, they may not have to if the Supreme Court rules against these tariffs, but expect the administration to turn right around and reimpose those tariffs under some other authority, existing authority that they'll claim they have. So this is a mess, and it's doing a lot to harm the economy today, and it's adding to the economic angst and the inflationary concerns of Americans.
Yeah, I think the leeway that a lot of voters, businesses, and even the GOP gave the president at first is running a lot more thin. I did want to ask you one more question. How do you think these members are going to deal with these facts? I think that conversation, again, among businesses and among voters and consumers in the United States is being felt. And I think come next year, voters are going to be asking these House and Senate members, where do you stand? How do you think they deal with this situation? Do you think there are going to be folks who try to walk the party line when it comes to Trump, or they see the thin ice and they're going to be a little bit more vocal?
Well, if you're a congressman or woman in a competitive district, you better find some distance between yourself and the president. You'll need some separation. And I think tariffs will be a good place to find that separation. And let me tell you what these members are facing. When they go home to their districts and they go visit a business, a manufacturing company, a small business, I guarantee you, they're going into that company, and either the owner or the plant manager, the general manager, is walking the congressman around the plant and say, "Oh, here's our inventory, by the way. See that stuff there? That stuff comes from Canada. That stuff comes from Mexico. That stuff comes from Europe. That stuff comes from Korea. The price went up." He'll say 10%, 15%, 25%, whatever, and he's going to say, "Congressman, what are you going to do about it?" That's what they're facing when they go home. You go to you're a farmer and you're a congresswoman or congressman in Iowa, and you go talk to some Iowa corn growers, and you talk to soybean growers, and they're saying, "Yeah, guess what? I need a bailout because I can't sell my product to China anymore. What are you going to do to help me?" And it's not just, and you know what? And the line for people wanting bailouts is getting really long. It's not just the farmers. It's going to be a lot of other folks. Mack Trucks in my area, I'm not saying they're asking for a bailout, but Mack Trucks, they laid off 200 to 300 people a few months ago, all because of tariffs. Now, they make trucks, okay? The cost of parts and other inputs and components have gone up. That's what these members are facing when they're at home. They see this, they know this, and many of them know this is bad policy. Many of the ones I serve with, particularly the older members, just do not embrace this type of naked protectionism. Frankly, that was the AFL-CIO position, which the Democrats more closely embraced, which of course the president is now embracing. So that's when I get back to our Republican legacy. We as a party need to get back to something more traditional in this sense. We should be about opening markets. We should be about fiscal discipline. We should be about being a country that believes in aspiration. That we're not a defeated nation. We are the point of the spear. We are a great, strong, powerful nation with many advantages. And I used to notice this too. The people who would ask for protection in my district were usually in the companies that were really struggling. The ones who were dynamic and who were doing well, they were asking us to open markets. This is where the growth was. And I always noticed that in my old congressional district. I think the same is true probably in every congressional district around the country. Those companies that are doing well, that are growing, they become much more dependent on exports to sustain their employment levels here in the United States. And I think that's one thing that Republicans know this instinctively. And I think we need to, again, re-embrace our more traditional values. Now, we're not going to go back as a party to where we once were, but we can get to a better place than where we are now.
Yeah, I think, without a doubt, this conversation of trade and tariffs will be center stage next year in conversations that members of Congress and their voters are going to have. I do want to thank again former Congressman Charlie Dent for being on. I appreciate your time today, Congressman.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. Again, this has been The Game, the show where we go play by play, analyzing the game of politics.